This is a conversation program. It has to do with talking about life and the things that are important to us, or that just are very tiny and insignificant, but are very worthwhile. And so it goes in many different directions, and we are glad that we can have these conversations, and we encourage you um, to use this as a basis for saying, I like to talk to people, and I want to talk to people with these kinds of conversations as well. And I can do it any place, in my home and in the store and so forth. And so today we have a friend, John Eric Robinson, and he has a special interest, and that interest is very important to him. So I'm going to let John tell us about that interest at this point.
Thanks, Len.
Welcome.
Thanks. John Eric is what I go by, and John Eric Robinson. So I'll tell it as a bit of a story, if that's all right.
That's right.
I was first introduced to the idea of permaculture by my stepbrother over 20 years ago, and he showed me a book, and he said it's the way plants work together. And he went on to buy 60 acres in southern Oregon and created a homestead, and that's where he makes his life. And I've never visited, unfortunately. And then my wife is a minister, and we've lived in parsonages our entire married life until recently. And she started saying, you know, I'd really like to stop mowing the lawn, because she realized that mowing the lawn was something that was contributing to pollution. And so I got her a book called Gaia's Garden, which was about turning lawns into food.
Mm-hmm.
And I read some of it, but it wasn't until my wife said that she really wanted to just own a home that something shifted for me, because living in property that wasn't mine never inspired me to do anything particular with it. You know, we took care of it, but it wasn't really ours to do with as we saw fit. So we did that. We bought a home in Weybridge, Vermont, and it was actually my father-in-law offering to give us a housewarming gift that got me started. He said, I'd like to give you a plant. And my wife said, that's great. There's this one part of the front that I'd like to put a plant in because it'll help block a view that I'd rather not have. And my father-in-law said, great, and they had it all worked out. And I said, well, what's the plant? And she said, well, it's this bush. And I said, well, what's the bush? And I talked with my father-in-law, and he told me what it was, and I looked it up, and I was like, wait a second, that bush drinks a lot of water, and it might not be the right thing. And all of a sudden I wanted to know, what is the right thing to put in our yard? And that had never been a concern of mine. I didn't really want to own property. I didn't know that I would have any interest. Part of our agreement was that she would do the yard work if we bought a place. And here I was taking an interest, to her surprise, and I said, I don't want that bush. Let me do some research. So that was a couple years ago. We bought our home in November of 2014, and this was all happening in the spring of 2015. And all of a sudden, I started coming across references to permaculture. And permaculture there's lots of ways to talk about it, but one way to talk about it is it's ecological gardening, or gardening with perennials. It's a gardening that takes nature into account, actually uses nature as a guide, but also thinks about what are our needs. So it's using nature as a guide to create abundant yields that humans can use and that are also good for the environment in the way that they all combine. So I came across videos by a fellow named Jeff Lawton, who's an Australian, and he was talking about ways of regenerating the earth. And I grew up in a generation where it felt like I learned that we were destroying the earth. That was the way that it seemed to me growing up, and that what I was learning in school and what my parents talked about. And here was a person saying, we can repair the damage. We can work with nature. And he was showing in a video, he was on some degraded land that had been landscaped with permaculture principles, and it had been dry, and they had put in some dams in the right places and some forest systems, and he knelt down and scooped up some water out of a spring that had been regenerated through this work, and he took a drink. And I tell you, that something opened up in me in that moment when I saw that. Something inside of me that had felt clenched just opened, and something melted away inside of me, and I came to believe that, wow, maybe we can turn this around. And I just felt deeply inspired, and I wanted to learn more. Mm-hmm. And so I watched everything that he had. He had a whole bunch of videos that were, and he kept posting more that were free, and I watched them all. I started talking about them. I had never had an interest, never had a garden. In many ways, I'm a total novice at this, but I've now spent the last year and a half immersing myself in this study, and I took a series of courses through Cornell University Extension with Steve Gabriel, who's a permaculture teacher. And now I'm about to start studying on it with an online course with Jeff Lawton himself. It starts on the 30th, and it's going to go for 6 months. I'm really excited.
Good. So, as you talk with people and you use the word permaculture, what kind of reactions do you get? What does that tell you about the way that word is regarded?
Yeah, most people don't know what it is. There are some permaculture practitioners here in Vermont. There's Ben Falk over in Moortown. There's just here in New Haven, there's Mark Krawczyk, and there's actually somebody in Salisbury who's going to be taking the class with me. So, but yeah, most people don't know. My family didn't know, and it's so. Yeah, I think it's one of these words that hasn't really caught on in the general population yet, but it's becoming more and more known because it really goes along with what a lot of people are concerned about, which is how can we become more resilient? How can we become more locally self-sufficient? And how can we work with the people in our community to take care of ourselves? And permaculture has a way of doing that, because it's really not just about creating a self-sufficient homestead off the grid. It's really about growing communities that become more and more self-sufficient and less dependent on international trade and things that could just, if that stuff starts breaking down, what will happen? If the grocery store doesn't have power, how are we going to feed ourselves that year? Permaculture offers answers to those questions.
It sounds like there's a whole wide range, from very simple to saying we need to be careful about how we plant, how we grow, to the implications of all these issues on not just us but on the bigger world. How does that feel to you?
It's exciting. It really is an all-encompassing way of thinking. It's my teacher, Jeff Lawton, calls it a design science. And so it's applying design principles to landscape and to homestead and building and even planning, city planning. It can be whole community planning. It could be the planning of a nation or a world. So it really does scale up and down. And right now, this class that's just in the process of forming already has people signed up from all over the world that are putting in questions, and they're talking about, I'm doing this in this environment, I'm doing this with these people, and we're creating a co-housing community, or I want to do this for my business. How can I get going? And Jeff Lawton's been doing this since the early 80s, and he's taught maybe hundreds of classes along the way.
What about the things, if you start on the simpler end of
Sure.
that,
Yeah.
if you start there, what are some of the things that you have learned and others have taught or shared that seem to be fairly simple and fairly direct, and
Yeah.
and you say to yourself, this makes sense.
I know.
And why didn't I think of this before? Can you give us a couple
absolutely.
examples of those?
So one of the first things you'll see if you pull up to my house, right now it's kind of covered up, but you'll see a bunch of, it's not a flat landscape. So what I did this last year is I let whatever was there grow to see what was there, in part, but also to give the bees and other pollinators a chance to keep feeding, because it turns out if you mow down everything on your lawn all the time, it becomes a desert for pollinators, and we're having a pollinator crisis. So one of the things that makes sense to me is that we give the pollinators what they need, which is they need nectar, they need a way of surviving, and we depend on them for many of our crops, and including our gardens. And we haven't always designed them in, so at this point people actually have to ship honeybees, sometimes from Vermont, all the way to places like California, just to pollinate, say, the almond groves. They just didn't design any space for the bees in the almond groves. So you have 1,000 acres of almonds, no bees, almonds won't grow if you don't have pollinators. You ship in your bees, and as you've probably heard, bees are having some troubles. You bring all the bees in the country to one place and then bring them back, and if there's a disease that they catch while they're there, the bee population could just plummet, and we are suffering from mites and so forth. So that's just one example. There's lots of things. I start thinking, people talk about, around here, no farms, no food. And that's true in our current economy for most people. But really, if you think about it, the largest amount of land in our country that we could be cultivating is lawn. We are cultivating lawn, in fact, because lawn isn't what you have if you just let it go. Lawn is what you make. You have to put a lot of energy into it to keep that grass down. Because around here, for example, what the earth wants to create was what was here before, which is a temperate forest. So permaculture says, why fight nature? Let's work with nature. Let's create, say, a forest garden that's going to be self-sustaining, that's going to take less and less work, but that's going to be really productive. So, for example, in my property, where I'm heading is towards productive tree crops as well as annuals, and the idea is that you have less and less work to do over time, because forests do fine on their own. And if we were gardening the way forests work, we'd be doing fine too.
Can you say a little bit more about the past history? You referred to that. Okay. And maybe fill in that picture a little bit.
Sure.
So it would be helpful.
Yeah. So permaculture was developed by a teacher in Australia named Bill Mollison and one of his graduate students, David Holmgren, back in the 70s. And they came out with a book in 1978 called Permaculture 1. And that was kind of the launch. And Bill Mollison, as the teacher, I think he was the guiding principle in that. And he had a really varied background. But among other things, he was a forester, he was a mariner, he grew up in Tasmania, and he saw the natural systems of his beloved homeland being decimated by the foresting and by the overfishing. And over time, as he did his jobs in the forest and in the sea, he started noticing things. And he he talks early on. He talks about early on thinking about the question. He said, physicists are living in homes with energy systems to heat them that make no sense. They're just inefficient, and yet they're physicists. They're people. We know how to design things, but we're not applying it in our daily lives as well as we could. What if we did? That was kind of his question that coalesced in this idea that, well, we can. We study ecology, we study design. What if we put those two together and we design with ecological principles at the center? And that's permaculture. So one way to think about it is we have conventional agriculture and we have forests, natural forests, and there's a continuum. And organic gardening is much closer to conventional agriculture. It's not using the same kinds of inputs with all the chemicals, but it's still tilling and so forth. What permaculture does is it comes in from the other side, and it says, let's try to grow things as close as we can to the way nature does. Nature doesn't till. We have over 1 billion years of evolution of life forms, and the life forms developed to grow with certain ideas in mind, and they're natural ideas. The human ideas, the way we've worked things, what's happening is we're losing topsoil. Some people say topsoil is our largest national export. And topsoil takes a while to grow. Permaculture builds topsoil.
When anything comes in new that's different than the way it used to be, there'll always be people who will be baffled by that, or confused, or disagree. Have you experienced those kinds of reactions to the whole idea of permaculture and permaculture working at its own pace?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just in our local paper, there was a discussion not too long ago, this past year, about the till, no-till question, and how much runoff you end up in our, for example, in Lake Champlain. People wonder about my lawn. I live across the street from a guy who works for John Deere, and he loves to mow his lawn. And most people in suburbia do. And people judge each other based on, how does that lawn look? My lawn looks more like a meadow. And not at the moment. I'm changing it over because I'm putting in, I'm sheet mulching. I'm putting down newspaper and wood chips, and I'm going to plant into that. But so that looks kind of landscaped. Yeah. My wife is a good example. My wife likes things to look ordered. She has a conventional job with people who, have opinions, and they are free. They feel free to share them with her. And she's a minister, as I said, United Methodist minister here in the area. People talk with her a lot more than they talk with me about our place. And she says, "Well, what am I going to say? Because it doesn't look the same as the lawns next to us." People are concerned. Are you just letting it go? We got a card under the wiper of one of our cars this past summer, and it said, no offense, but if you'd like me to mow your lawn, I do a lawn service.
Yeah, I understand that, because I lived in my family in one of the classic New Jersey suburban areas, between two houses that had manicured lawns, and I was barely able to keep the lawnmower running enough to get the grass to go down, and didn't do anything beyond that.
Okay.
And I know I was the Scrooge of the neighborhood. They never said it, but I knew that was the case. So it is that. But in the long run, it's your view is that it's the important change that needs to be made.
It is. It's interesting when you look at something that the culture believes is really important. If you look really closely at it, I think it's important to say, well, why? Why is the manicured lawn so important? I think it's a really good question because it's one of those cultural assumptions. And, you know, in a world where there's more and more and more people and construction and development and less space for nature, if we don't make enough space for nature, even if we have enough space for farms, we're still going to not make it. The farms still depend on sun, rain, topsoil. You know, conventional agriculture is not being run in a sustainable manner. We got to figure something out, and it's going to have to take change. But you're right; it's tricky to be doing something different than your neighbors, and all of us kind of want to be part. Most of us want to kind of fit in.
But given that is so, but if we believe in something, what is it that we do? What is it we can do to persevere and help people understand the project that you have in mind?
Well, I made myself a bumper sticker. There was a make your own bumper sticker place, and so I did, and my bumper sticker on the car I drove here today says in smaller green type, light green type, earth care plus people care equals, and then in bigger type, dark green, permaculture. It's education.
Okay.
So people who see my car will at least have seen the word permaculture. My wife says, unless you get pretty close, you can't see the top part as well. But I'm like, yeah, that's okay, because that's part of what's interesting about these any bumper sticker is, you know, there's stuff that's big, like got milk. Yeah. Well, the milk's big, but you don't see the got until you get
always reading. There's always reading for the parking lot.
And the parking lot. And so that car is parked in our driveway, and anyone who goes by our street gets a lot of foot traffic and bike traffic, and college teams run by and ski by on their wheeled skis and so forth. You know, they're going to see that word, and they're, you know, and it's not just a word. It says what it means, not in a way that totally makes sense. I mean, what does that mean? Earth care plus people care. But if you think about it, it sounds good. So it might be something that'll pique someone's interest.
Has the message caught on through the devices of media? Do you find that media is still playing with personal things that people want to Twitter about or want?
Yeah, it is. It is. That's how I found it. You know, like I said, I started looking, and then there was Jeff Lawton, and he's online. And I'm taking an online course, and the courses I took through Cornell were online. And I'm not a Twitter person myself, but I could be. You know, I could certainly be convinced of it. The bumper sticker is just one step in the direction of, you know, getting the word out, and it's part of why I'm here today. Because when my wife couldn't make it, she said, "Well, John Eric's kind of an evangelist for permaculture, so I think he would welcome."
She did.
So yeah, I think media makes it. Media gets the message out there, and a lot of people are out there trying to figure out, how can I live in a way that's more sustainable? How can I help repair the earth? And if you look far enough, you're going to find this is one of the ideas.
Does permaculture spawn group action?
Absolutely.
And talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
What does that look like? And what do you think, if it's not happening or it's just the beginning, what could happen that would make it something more viable and moving?
Yeah, it does. It's actually part of the concept as Bill Mollison came up with it. He said the last chapter of his book called Permaculture: A Designer's Manual is all about organizing. And he said this is not, like I said before, it's not about creating a self-sufficient off-grid homestead. This is about growing communities that help one another and become more locally self-sufficient. So Jeff Lawton, my teacher, says if you can get 100 people to meet once a month for 5 years talking about these ideas, in 5 years you'll have lots of things in place. And one of the things you'll have in place is you'll know who you want to live with, who you want to be neighbors with, who you want to do these projects with, because you'll have had that opportunity to talk things through. But there's so much more you'll have, because when you have groups of people talking together, you share resources, you share your research, you say, how did you do it? And right now, in my class, what we have is a class forum, and Jeff Lawton is opening up a class, he's opening up a forum, an international forum, where anyone who wants to can be part of this conversation. And people are asking questions, and what do I do on my place, and how do I do this in my community? Absolutely. It does spawn action.
Does it connect with organizations such as the Forestry Department and any other governmental agencies?
There are nonprofits that it connects with directly. There's a place called the Land Institute that's developing perennial crop systems. And there's the Rondale Institute. I don't know of this being practiced by any governmental institutions, but the thing is about permaculture is it uses ideas that other people are already developing and using. So foresters are trying to figure out how to create sustainable forestry. And those ideas are something that permaculture embraces. Permaculture is more of an umbrella and an ethical system saying it matters that we take care of the earth. It matters that we take care of people. Research that's unguided by ethics is unmoored, and we need to anchor it in ethics. And that's really what permaculture offers. It's an ethical design system that can work on all scales.
Our half hour moves along quickly.
I guess so.
And so let me ask you to focus.
Okay.
And say, before we depart from this table, and what is it you'd really like to say that would encourage people to take permaculture seriously and discover something of what you have discovered about the world and how the world really needs to function, and what contribution we can make for it? What would you say is
I would say, if you're interested, want to learn more, look it up. Look up permaculture. Look up Jeff Lawton. His name is spelled Geoff. Lawton, Lawton, and see what he has to offer. And if you want a book, the first book I read was called Paradise Lot, the story of two plant geeks on 1/10 of an acre creating a garden oasis in the city. It's a really easy read. If you want to learn more, I guess the wonderful thing about the internet is that it's available. And if you see me on the street, feel free to ask me.
Are there any gatherings, where people of a like mind, or possibly of a like mind, if they've had the experience, any of those in place, or could they be in place?
They absolutely could. Like I said, it is my hope to help get something going, a conversation in person. But as I said, there are already conversations online, and it's available. People who want to get plugged in can definitely do that.
We thank you for this conversation today, and we're looking forward to what comes next.
Thank you, Len.
And we're grateful for your time. And there are stories galore in all that you said, and that people have, and more that they can have if we care for our world. So thank you.
Thank you, Len.